You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas. Hope you guys are having a great 2025 so far. My guest today runs a terrific channel on YouTube called Unto Ages. His name's Bailey Mullins, and I can tell you in his description for Unto Ages, I'll kind of read that so I don't even have to give you my own spin on it. Although my own spin is that it's fantastic. As soon as I started watching some of his work, I reached out to him to talk today about this specific topic, but it delves into topics including, but not limited to, apologetics, philosophy, theology, and personal reflections. His work over there is fantastic. It seems to be, from what I can understand, a one-man show. So he's creating these, doing the audio, video editing, all of these things. So go check out Unto Ages. He did a video called Judaism is Not What You Think. And it had me thinking about this term that I grew up hearing and assuming was a correct term, Judeo-Christianity. And I would even hear, America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. And it's like, wait a second, why are they lumping Judaism in with Christianity? I started asking myself this as I learned more about the history of the church and Christianity and the Orthodox Church, because wait a second, isn't Judaism specifically anti-Christ, anti-Christian? So why is it lumped in with Christianity? You may have asked yourself this same thing. So let's dive into this topic today, and I hope you guys learned something from this great guest for the first time on Counterflow, Bailey Mullins. Welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. I love your YouTube channel, Unto Ages. I will let you, since this is your first time, give an intro for yourself, anything you want my audience to know, and then we will get into this not controversial topic at all.
Yeah, so I'm Bailey. I run a channel called Unto Ages. As I was telling Buck, I just kind of started this thing last year to kind of share my story, my journey into Orthodoxy, and that grew and was received positively. And so I decided to continue and do more apologetics type stuff. So I've done a few apologetics videos and some that are, like the one we might be talking about today. It's a little controversial. And I plan to be doing some other interviews with priests and monks and other kind of stuff like that in the coming years. So got a lot of good ideas that I'd like to be expanding upon over the next year or two. So yeah.
What is your what was your journey into Orthodoxy? We can do that kind of briefly. And then what were you prior to that? What was your religious background, if at all?
Yeah, so I grew up Baptist. And probably towards the end of my high school years, early college, I was kind of questioning, okay, do I really believe Christianity is true? And if so, I need to have reasons why I believe that it's true. And so that kind of sent me into online apologetics, and I ended up believing, okay, yes, Christianity is true, but where do I fit theologically? Where does, I grew up Baptist, like, how do I know that the Baptists are right as opposed to, the Catholics or the Lutherans or whatever? I didn't even know about Orthodoxy. I had a professor in college who was Orthodox, and one of the courses I took was comparative religion, and then she recommended I also take her ancient Christianity course, which is basically church history. And as a Protestant, I didn't really know anything about church history. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of was the first rock in my shoe, I guess. That was probably 2018 or so. And then I went to my first liturgy in 2019. And over the course of several years, kind of looked into Orthodoxy, podcasts, books, YouTube videos. And finally, when I moved out to Nashville, Tennessee, I started attending church more regularly at that point. And I was received in 2022.
Very nice. That's really neat that your professor was Orthodox. Do you still maintain communications with her?
Yeah, we do. So she was a professor just at a public college. It wasn't like a, private Christian school or anything. But so she's not teaching now, just because the humanities are kind of dying. And so her workload went from like full-time to part-time to now she's just not doing that at all. But I'll actually be moving back to South Carolina next week, in a few days when this video comes out. So I will be definitely keeping in closer contact. She'll be a little bit closer at that point.
Very nice. Well, this video that inspired this interview, let's say, the video on your page, Unto Ages, was called Judaism is Not What You Think. And boy, you got some views on that one, a lot.
Yeah, I was not expecting that.
Well,
I was expecting it to get a little bit more than maybe some of my others, but I definitely didn't expect it to become my most popular video in like a week or two.
Yeah, it blew up. I loved it. It was well done. I immediately reached out to you, and I wanted to cover this topic from various angles this year because I think there's good things going on politically and culturally where things feel like they're shifting rightward, let's say, from where it's been over the last several years. But there's this weird sticking point within political circles in the Republican Party where there's this obsession with Zionism in Israel. And sometimes I understand that a lot of these guys are getting their pockets lined by AIPAC and whatnot, maybe with no ideological or religious bent at all towards this stuff. But it can be passed off as a theological issue. Often they're going to say it's geopolitical, but when you kind of break that down, it's like, well, there's Islam and there's Jew. It's still theological in my opinion. And right. I did an episode last year with Father John Whiteford called "Bad Theology Leads to Bad Actions" or something along those lines. It was about Zionism and whatnot. And so I want to keep harping on the fact that Judeo-Christianity, that phrase, the misconceptions about Israel and the Zionist kind of mindset and where that's all stemming from is bad theology, and we can see it playing out into bad actions. And so that's sort of what I'm going to cover this topic throughout this year for sure. So let's start off with the term Judeo-Christian and what that is and how you view it.
Yeah, so I think the term Judeo-Christian, I think the only legitimate use for that word where it would actually make sense, where it's actually coherent, would be describing someone who was once Jewish and became a Christian. So like
St.
Paul would be considered a Judeo-Christian because he was Jewish and became Christian. The way it's used nowadays, I think, is kind of an oxymoron. And as time goes on, as this interview goes on, I hope to make that clear because a lot of people think Judaism and Christianity are the same thing or close, like they're brothers, the Abrahamic faiths, that whole thing. But in reality, Judaism today is not the same thing as Judaism in the Bible. And a lot of people just don't know this history. But at the time of Christ, there was various Jewish factions, which is commented on in the Gospels. You've got like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, others that are not mentioned, like the Essenes. And all of these parties required the temple in order to do sacrifice, in order for their religion to function. But when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, which Jesus predicted, the Jews couldn't make their sacrifices anymore. And so they had to figure out, okay, what do we do? And eventually the Pharisee party was the one that emerged victorious out of that. And basically what is known as Rabbinic Judaism was formed. And the other groups, for the most part, died out. I mean, there's some that are, very small and fringy that still exist. But the Rabbinic Jews developed new doctrines that were centered around the Old Testament and a collection of rabbinic writings known as the Talmud. And just so people know, this is not something I'm making up. This is actually something that the Jewish Encyclopedia itself will state. Jewish Encyclopedia was published in the early 20th century. And according to the American Jewish Archives, it is the most monumental Jewish scientific work of modern times. So that text has the following to say about the Pharisaic influence on Judaism. It says, quote, "With the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees disappeared altogether, leaving the regulation of all Jewish affairs in the hands of Pharisees. Henceforth, Jewish life was regulated by the Pharisees. The whole history of Judaism was reconstructed from the Pharisaic point of view. Pharisaism shaped the character of Judaism and the life and the thought of the Jew for all of the future." So this is kind of the milieu and the history of what's happening post-Christianity. We're going to get into some of the documents and texts that came out of that. But one other thing that I would like to mention, just make clear to people about this whole Judeo-Christian thing, is our values don't align. A lot of people will say, oh, you know, they look to like Daily Wire and, you know, say, oh, well, they've got like Catholics and they've got a Jewish guy or multiple Jewish people. Like, you know, they align on a lot of these things, but it's not immediately clear that that is the case from Judaism. There's the obvious matter of Jews denying the Messiah, but on a moral ground, it's a little bit more questionable because polygamy actually used to be the standard in Judaism. According to Harry Friedman, who is a Jewish author, he says, quote, "Because Ashkenazi Jews have lived among Christians for so long, Christianity has influenced our behavior. Perhaps the most striking example of this is this prohibition of polygamy imposed by an Ashkenazi rabbi made in the 11th century to harmonize Jewish society with the norms of Christianity." And in addition to that claim, there's a video I'd like to show of IDF soldiers who are desecrating an Orthodox church, performing a mock gay wedding. That's just a few months ago. So I will play that here real quick.
All right.
Oh, the great Mary!
מי מחתן אותנו?
קשו אליו. שם החתן? מוישה. שם הכלה? טוב, הגענו לערב הזה. הגענו לערב הזה אחרי כמה זמן של זוגיות? 6 שנים. כאן בטקס הזה. הרי אתה, חתן, נשים את כל...
Okay, anyway, you get the point.
Mm-hmm. Where was that?
In Lebanon.
Okay. And was that an Orthodox church that they had basically taken over?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And just to kind of wrap up on this point, later in that article, per Harry Friedman, he admits that Judaism is actually closer to Islam in terms of theology and practice than it is to Christianity, which is also what I've mentioned and tried to explain through my videos on the Islam and Judaism topics. He states that unlike the Catholic Church, Judaism is not categorically opposed to abortion. There is no dogma in Judaism which declares that life begins at conception or indeed at any other particular moment. There is no need for such dogma. That's not how Judaism works. The Jewish position on abortion is very clear. The mother's life has primacy.
Is there... Well, let me ask you this. Can you break down the confusion of the folks that are going to say, well, that we worship the same God. It's just they're worshiping the Old Testament version. And I know to a lot of my Orthodox listeners, this sounds silly, but this is something that I've heard and that people do say, and how, well, they just don't understand the New Testament. Well, that's Christ. And so there's just some confusion and misconceptions with that. Otherwise, everything's the same.
Yeah. So that is a common trope and common narrative, because a lot of people will talk about either Judeo-Christian or the Abrahamic faiths and try and lump in Islam there, because they all worship the same God. They just don't, they don't accept the Trinity. But the problem is, like, that's incoherent, because the Trinity cannot be divided.
Right.
So when you divide the Trinity, it's not the Trinity anymore.
Right.
So if Muslims and Jews worship the Father, but not the Son and the Holy Spirit, they're not worshiping the same thing as what Christians are worshiping. Jesus even says in the Gospels, no man comes into the Father except by me.
Yeah.
So they're inextricably linked. And we have this very clear in early Christian theology that you cannot divide the Trinity. That's why we say the Trinity is undivided and indivisible.
Yes.
And so when you divide it, then it's not the same thing. It's
right.
It's very simple, but a lot of people don't have that very basic catechesis and understanding of the Trinity, because they don't come from a tradition that emphasizes that.
Mm-hmm. Once a month, my supporters of this show and myself and a special guest have a Zoom meeting. It's not recorded, it's not posted, it's just private. It's between you guys, the guest, and myself. I do this because it means a lot for you guys who support me by showing me that this show means a lot to you. I love talking with you. I look at it as like a benefit for people that support the show, but it's really a benefit for me. I get to know you guys and have an off-the-record discussion with our guest, and sometimes topics you don't want to necessarily have all the ins and outs discussed online, if you know what I mean. So to be in this group, please go to patreon.com/counterflow and donate $5 or more per month. And it gets you in this club. We do it once a month. It's a great time. It's great people. They're all smarter than me. So that's an upgrade from what you're used to. I can tell you that. The guests are always guests that people want to hear from. A lot of you guys will be familiar with many of the guests. Father Turbo's done it. Father Deacon Ananias has done it. David Patrick Carey's done it. My own priest, Father Ignatius, has done it. Father Moses McPherson's done it. It's a very good time, and I think you guys would enjoy it. If you love this content, please go to patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month. Thank you. Or that even realizes that it's the Trinity's basically discussed in Genesis. And
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I have that. We'll probably get to that later.
Okay.
Because that's basically what John is talking about in the first chapter of John.
Yeah.
He's expanding upon Genesis.
Yeah.
Chapter 1.
Yeah. That was coming to orthodoxy. That was one of the most mind-blowing, I suppose, aspects it's like, why didn't I know this? But
yeah, well, I got the Orthodox Study Bible and opened it up. This is before I became Orthodox, and I opened it up, start with Genesis, and I'm reading the footnotes for verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, and it blows my mind. I'm like, wait, how did I not pick up on this? That literally Genesis 1 is talking about the Trinity.
Yes. Let's talk about one of the things. I want to discuss the Talmud here. And one of the things I've heard push back on certain videos that I've put out or whatnot is, look, you were putting way more emphasis on the Talmud than Jewish people do. So yes, there's some negative things in it, but go talk to your Jewish friends. They don't read it. It doesn't matter. It's somewhat like you would say modern American Christian doesn't actually read the Bible or something like that. But can you speak to that?
Yeah. So the Talmud is essentially, just to give a little bit of the history of it, it comes from 70 elders, the Sanhedrin, who supposedly received this oral tradition at the base of Mount Sinai while Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments. And after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, Jews returned to Babylon in AD 140, and this is when they're writing down the Talmud. So the Talmud is a multi-volume, it's a huge document, a series of books that you've got basically the Mishnah, which is the oral tradition, and then you've got the Gemara, which is the rabbinic response to the Mishnah. And it's basically these rabbis going back and forth about how to apply the law in like meticulously detailed and boring, very, very granular, like how to apply this law in every single scenario. It's really boring. So for people who want to go read the Talmud thinking that it's, this conspiracy text, it's not that. 90 to 95% of it is just boring rabbis arguing against one another. And it is, to be fair, it is not dogmatic in the sense that they are bound by it because it's these different Jewish rabbis' interpretations of various passages. But you can't just throw it out because it's their opinion, man. Like, oh, it's just their opinion, so we're not gonna. It holds a place in Jewish tradition, and it informs a lot of the way rabbinic Jews see other people and the world and Christians and other things. So it's not, you can't completely relativize it just because it's not dogmatic.
And for the people listening that hear that term rabbinic Jew, I had, again, my episode with Father John Whiteford to clarify that the rabbinic Jews are what you would see now in a temple. That's what that is. Just so. Yeah,
basically, it's the Pharisee party that survived, and it's basically the Orthodox Jewish view. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to go over any of the passages from the Talmud that what the view of Christ is and Mary?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I want to go through. And that was actually one of the criticisms I received on my video and admittedly, there were a lot of people coming in who are not familiar with my content. And I tend to give like the cliff notes. I like to just not waste your time. And so what I did was I summarized the Talmud, and there's like a 5-minute portion of that video that talks about the Talmud. And the rest of it is more scripture and other arguments against Judaism. And so people were upset that I didn't quote the Talmud. So I'll use this opportunity to quote the Talmud and appease those people so that they can hear for themselves what it has to say. There's a couple things I want to mention before we get to that, though. The Talmud actually doesn't reject the miracles of Jesus. It actually just says that he performed them through magic or sorcery. And it explicitly claims that Jesus led astray the Jews through magic and idolatry. And this is actually consistent with what we see the Pharisees saying in Matthew on 9:34, when they say that Jesus casts out demons by the ruler of demons, and in Matthew 12:24, when they claim that Jesus does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons. And also, between the time of Jesus' crucifixion and the temple, the destruction of the temple in AD 70, there's actually a number of miraculous omens that occurred, which the Talmud itself reports upon. The eternal fire in the altar refused to remain lit, and the bronze gates to the temple opened on their own. And Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, also adds his own observations. He says that there was a bright light in the altar at 3 a.m., a cow brought for sacrifice, which gave birth to a lamb, and apparitions of chariots and armies flying through the sky above the lands of Israel. These omens ceased after the destruction of the temple. So this is all relevant because I think it should set the stage for what we're about to discuss within the Talmud, and then, we'll get to kind of a Christian approach to these things later. So there's a few passages that pretty undeniably reference Jesus. So one of them is Sanhedrin 107b, verse 8. It says, "The sages taught, always have the left hand drive sinners away and the right draw them near, so that the sinners will not totally despair of atonement. This is unlike Elijah, who pushed away Gehazi with his 2 hands and caused him to lose his share in the world to come, unlike Yehoshua ben Periah, who pushed away Jesus the Nazarene with his 2 hands." So that's a very minor incursion. It's, this guy doesn't like Jesus. That's not that big of a deal. Okay. So we get to Sanhedrin 43a, 20 through 21, and this is the one that's very infamous. A lot of apologists will reference this one because this is the one where Jesus is crucified, and this is that passage, basically. It says, "On Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning. And a crier went forth before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming, Jesus the Nazarene is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Anyone who knows of a reason to acquit him should come forward and teach it on his behalf. And the court did not find a reason to acquit him, so they stoned him and hung his corpse on Passover Eve. Ulla said, and how can you understand this proof? Was Jesus the Nazarene worthy of conducting a search for a reason to acquit him? He was an insider to idol worship, and the merciful one states, with regard to an insider of idol worship, neither shall you spare, neither shall you conceal him. Deuteronomy 13:9. Rather, Jesus was different, as he had close ties with the government, and the Gentile authorities were interested in his acquittal. Consequently, the court gave him every opportunity to clear himself so that it could not be claimed that he was falsely convicted. So the Gentile authorities that it's talking about here would most likely be the Romans, because if you remember from the Gospels, Pilate attempted to set Jesus free, but the Jews did not want that. Stoning, while not the historically accurate method of execution for Jesus, it was how idolaters were killed. As it states in Sanhedrin 67a, verse 8, it states, a prophet who subverted others to participate in idol worship is executed by stoning. And one other thing is the many Old Testament prophets were also stoned. And even the Jewish Encyclopedia article on Jesus concedes that this passage is about the Jesus that Christians worship. The next passage is Avodah Zarah 27b, verse 6. And just a FYI, I'm not Hebrew. I don't know how to pronounce some of these names. So if I butcher them, forgive me. So it states, there was an incident involving Ben Dama, son of Rabbi Ishmael's sister, in which a snake bit him. And following the attack, Yaakov of the village of Sychania, who was a heretic, a disciple of Jesus the Nazarene, came to treat him. But Rabbi Ishmael did not let him do so. And Ben Dama said to him, Rabbi Ishmael, my brother, let him treat me, and I will be healed by him. And I will cite a verse from the Torah to prove that accepting medical treatment from a heretic is permitted in this situation. But Ben Dama did not manage to complete this statement before his soul departed his body and he died. So this man could have received healing, but the Jews forbid it because they viewed Jesus as a heretic. Got a few more here. Avodah Zarah 17a, verse 1. Rabbi Elazar said to him, Akiva, you are right, as you have reminded me that once I was walking in the upper marketplace of Zispori, I found a man who was one of the students of Jesus the Nazarene, and his name was Yaakov of Kfar Sychania. He said to me, it is written in your Torah, you shall not bring the payment to a prostitute or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord your God, Deuteronomy 23:19. What is the halakha? Is it permitted to make from the payment to a prostitute for the services rendered a bathroom for the high priest in the temple? And I said nothing to him in response. So here the implication is that Jesus is teaching his followers to profit from illicit sexual behavior between a prostitute and a priest, basically. This is consistent with their continual slander that Jesus himself engages in such behavior, as we'll see with this next passage. Sota 47a, 13-14. When he came back to Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yehoshua arrived at a certain inn. The innkeeper stood before him, honoring him considerably, and overall they accorded him great honor. Rabbi ben Yehoshua ben Perahiah then sat and was praising them, saying, how beautiful is this inn? Jesus the Nazarene, one of his students, said to him, my teacher, but the eyes of the innkeeper's wife are narrow. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Pariah said to him, wicked one, is this what you are engaged in, gazing at women? He brought out 400 shepharot and excommunicated him. Every day Jesus would come before him, but he would not accept his wish to return. One day, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Pariah was reciting Shema when Jesus came before him. He intended to accept him on this occasion, so he signaled to him with his hand to wait. Jesus thought he was rejecting him entirely. He therefore went and stood up a brick and worshipped it as an idol. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Periah said to him, "Return from your sins." Jesus said to him, "This is a tradition I received from you. Anyone who sins, causes the masses to sin, is not given the opportunity to repent." The Gemara explains how he caused the masses to sin. For the master said, Jesus the Nazarene performed sorcery, and he incited the masses and subverted the masses and caused the Jewish people to sin. Sanhedrin 107b-14 also claims essentially the same thing. And the last passage that we'll go through is Gittin 57a, verse 4. This is probably the worst one. Onkelos said to him, "What is the punishment of that man?" A euphemism for Jesus himself in the next world. Jesus said to him, "He is punished with boiling excrement." As the master said, anyone who mocks the words of the sages will be sentenced to boiling excrement. And this was his sin, and he mocked the words of the sages. So, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia article on Jesus' advice to people as he's in hell burning in excrement, supposedly, he says that people should bless the Jews. He says, quote, "Further their well-being. Do nothing to their detriment. Whoever touches them touches even the apple of my eye." Now, I'm going to go ahead and anticipate some objection to this because some Jewish historians actually claim that this is not Jesus. These passages in the Talmud, Jesus is a common name. It's referring to a different Jesus. But if you go to Sepharia, which is a website that preserves the Talmud, there's actually, it's very kind of them, there's a whole website, a whole link that allows you to see the references to Jesus in the Talmud. That's the Jesus of Nazareth that they're referring to. Also, there are other Jewish sources, which we'll mention later, like the Toledot Yeshu, that both confirm Toledot Yeshu and the Jewish Encyclopedia. They all confirm that Jesus is referenced in the Talmud. And I think this is kind of an academic debate. It's not really something that most people question.
Mm-hmm.
But relating to that, there are two other clips that I'd like to show.
Okay.
One is trigger warning. It is a Jewish rabbi screaming about Jesus burning in hell. Should I read the subtitles? Because this is in Hebrew.
Yeah, let's just do that.
Okay, so I'm going to mute this and I'll just read the subtitles.
Yeah.
He says, two wise guys who think they're all that and started a fight with every Jew out there. They started a fight with everyone. You went and lit a fire. There's no backing out of it now. If they keep doing this, the amount of blowback will be unimaginable. There's no end to the punishment of those who deceive and lead astray. Their suffering will only be equal to that of the cursed one, Jesus. The Talmud says that the founder of Christianity has been sentenced to boil in feces, a pile of boiling feces, excrement from the bowels of humans, cats, dogs, lions, and tigers, boiling and bubbling feces. That's where he is right now. That's how he's being punished every waking moment. That's the Talmud. You forgot to mention that, huh? All the churches and all of their crosses. The big statue on that mountain in Brazil. Blown to smithereens. All the world will see it. They'll all see it. The big lie will be exposed. The Christian lie will be exposed. According to them, God can take away everybody's sin on his broad shoulders. Of everybody. He'll cover all of their transgressions. And if nothing happened, you'll all get into heaven. What idiocy. How retarded can a person be? How thick in the head is that? How idiotic and retarded. I've no other words to describe such a person who believes this nonsense? So, very kind words that they have to say. And the other one that I'm going to pull up here is someone actually confronted Ben Shapiro about these passages, and this was his response.
You have consistently promoted the idea that America was built on Judeo-Christian values. However, as a devout Christian, I have difficulty accepting the term, given Judaism's rejection of Jesus. Christians believe Jesus Christ is God. In contrast, the Talmud, a central Jewish holy book, teaches that Jesus is burning in hellfire and excrement. And while the New Testament tells us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, Sovereign 15 of the Talmud states that even the best of the Gentiles should be killed. Given these irreconcilable differences, why do you insist on using this oxymoronic term?
Okay, so first of all, that's a really bad read of the Talmud. Second of all, the notion that you can cite any text in support of the idea that Judaism broad writ is somehow disdainful or hateful of Christians or of people who are not Jewish is in fact a tremendous misread of Judaism over the centuries and particularly today. I can cite sections in the New Testament that I find personally problematic. I can certainly cite segments in the Quran that I find personally problematic. The truth is I could probably find place in the Old Testament that I find personally problematic. That does not speak to what Judaism is and its historic impact on the world. Judaism is the foundation of Christianity. Jesus himself acknowledged this. The New Testament acknowledges this. The notion that Judaism and Christianity are somehow completely delinked and teach two completely separate lessons ignores the fact that the Old Testament is part and parcel of the New Testament. Sure, Christians and Jews think different things. Of course. Otherwise, I'd be a Christian or you'd be a Jew. If we thought completely the same thing, then presumably we would have the exact same religion. But the notion that Judaism and Christianity are completely delinked is wrong. As far as miscitations from the Talmud, or even citations of texts that are written in the year 500 CE at a time when Jews were being persecuted by Christians in the Roman Empire, that seems to me a real stretch to get to the idea that Jews today are overall hateful of Christians. I'm not sure that there's anybody in America, personally speaking, who has pushed more people back to church than me. I really don't know that there is anybody who's done that. I tell Christians literally all the time to go to church. I tell Christians all the time to re-engage with their faith. I think it is deeply, deeply important that they do. I don't try to convert people to Judaism because that's actually forbidden in Jewish law. I'm not supposed to convert people to Judaism. So I know there's a group of people who spend all day online cherry-picking bad lines from the Talmud, a text that they have no familiarity with, and then trying to spin that into a giant myth about how Jews are seeking the extermination of Christians or some other bizarre conspiracy theory. It's a lie, it's stupid, and the Judeo-Christian values of the nation are quite real because, once again, Judaism and Christianity have an awful lot in common.
What I gleaned from that is he didn't really answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
He just kind of obfuscated. It's not what it sounds like. It's something else. He doesn't really answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the passages that are most explicit that I'm confident presenting that are about Jesus. There's a few also about Mary we can go through if you'd like. There's not as many, but
I kind of want to move to how the Orthodox Church explains and teaches the Old Testament covenant and the New Testament covenant, because this is key, in my opinion, to grasping the reality of why Judeo-Christian is not a correct term. Can we get into that?
Yeah, sure. So there's not really, a lot of people think there's like the old covenant, that's a separate thing, and then there's the new covenant, and that's a separate thing, but there's not really actually a break between the old and new covenant. Orthodoxy, we view that as the continuation and fulfillment of what God was doing with Israel in the Old Testament. And we see that we view that properly understood, the church is Israel. St. Paul calls the church the Israel of God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are fathers in the faith because we've been grafted in, like St. Paul says in Romans. The early Christians worshipped in the synagogue, and they only stopped when they were kicked out. So there's actually quite a few parallels between Orthodox Jewish and Orthodox Christian worship.
Yes.
Orthodox Christians and Orthodox Jews both use incense. We both read Psalms in our services. Orthodox Christian chanting is very similar to what one would hear if you went to an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. Rather than bringing out the Torah, we process with the gospel book. rather than sacrificing an animal, Christ is the eternal sacrifice in the Eucharist, a sacrifice of praise, as we say in the liturgy. The way we build our churches finds its origins in Second Temple Judaism. Our priests' vestments have many parallels to the priestly vestments of the Old Testament. And we also have the unbroken apostolic succession back to the time of the apostles. The book of Hebrews also doesn't really make much sense without understanding that it's informed by Second Temple Jewish worship. Our liturgy has very distinct parallels to the heavenly worship that's revealed to Moses, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and John. And because of that, we can't just do away with it without doing irreparable damage to what orthodoxy is. And if we compare that to Rabbinic Judaism, which lacks a temple and therefore lacks a sacrifice, has no legitimate claim to the Old Testament priesthood, as the lineage has been broken, and also has a very limited and narrow soteriology, it's primarily an ethno-religion whose aim is to acquire land for the Jews so they can work out their salvation, and who really cares what happens with everyone else. Again, in Christianity, though, all are free to accept Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, by definition, cannot be an ethno-religion because St. Paul says there is neither Jew nor Greek, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. All are welcome to be grafted into the church. The scope of Christianity is cosmic, not merely geopolitical. And so, if any of these topics interest people, I recommend the book Orthodox Worship by Benjamin Williams and Harold Anstall. It kind of talks about the parallels between Second Temple Jewish worship and early Christian worship. And there's also a video by Orthodox Shahada that's also titled Christian Worship in the Old Testament that kind of goes into this same topic.
Israel has been granted the promised land already. You ever hear that?
Yeah. So, to kind of continue and expand upon the misinterpretations of some of these things, there's some people that believe the word Israel in the Old Testament is synonymous to the modern day nation state of Israel, which came into existence in 1948. They think, because of their misreading of scripture, they think that the Old Testament land fulfillment prophecies still apply to modern Jews who reject their Messiah, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Right.
But we Orthodox Christians don't accept that. We think that's probably just a word concept fallacy, and it's built upon Protestant theology that's really only existed for about 100 years. So, as you mentioned, the land promises have already been fulfilled. Mm-hmm. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Why was Israel granted the promised land in the first place? According to Deuteronomy 9, today you are about to cross the Jordan and go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you. When the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say in your heart, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me to possess this land. Rather, the Lord is driving out these nations before you because of their wickedness. Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess. For you are a stiff-necked people. Remember this and never forget how you provoked the Lord your God in the wilderness. It's also important and worth noting that this promise is conditional. In Deuteronomy 4:40, it states, "Keep his decrees and commands which I am giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God gives you for all time." And the conditional nature of this promise is elaborated upon in Leviticus 20 through verses 22 through 23. You are therefore to keep all of my statutes and ordinances, so the land where I am bringing you to live will not vomit you out. You must follow the statutes of the nations I am driving out before you. You must not follow the statutes of the nations I am driving out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. So ergo, if Israel is not faithful to God, they do not get the land.
Mm-hmm.
Moreover, this promise is later considered fulfilled in like past tense in Joshua 21 verses 43 through 45, which states, "So the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hands. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass." So I think these passages should be enough to refute any kind of Zionism, but unfortunately, Zionism is not the most theologically coherent position.
Mm-hmm. And just for those listening that hear that term often thrown around, sometimes incorrectly, what is Zionism?
Zionism, it's whatever you want it to be, really.
That's the thing.
You can metamorphosize it.
Yes.
Some say that Zionism is merely the right for the nation state of Israel to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Others will state that you must bow, basically, to the nation state of Israel, and you must kowtow to the nation state of Israel. The way I view it is essentially people who have a vested interest and push in making Israel great, I guess, whatever that entails.
And can you get into a little bit how the people that think that modern state that started in 1948 is the same thing that is in the Bible is incorrect, because the Orthodox Church is Israel. And I think that's very, there's a clip that went viral of my own priest from an episode we did live explaining the church is Israel. The church is Israel. And I would get comments under it saying, that's replacement theology. That's not true. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's replacement theology. It's not what it says. It's not what the Bible says. Yeah, that's not it's not what we believe. We believe that the church is Israel, like you said. And so I actually plan to do an interview with a priest, hopefully on my channel this year, to kind of expand upon this topic exactly. But just to kind of give like a short answer to the question, Israel refers to those who are faithful to God. All throughout the Old Testament, the Jews are struggling to be faithful to God. They do well for a while, and then they fall away and turn to their idols, and then they get back up, and then they rinse and repeat. This is an archetypal problem. Everybody struggles with this. But there's always individuals throughout these times in the Old Testament that remain faithful to God. These people are the true Israel. So if we fast forward to the time of Christ, in John 14:6, he boldly states, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So either what Jesus says is true or it's not. It's not a metaphor. Either people accept the Messiah or they don't. There's no dual covenant.
Right.
Because that's what people implicitly are arguing
Yes.
when they say, oh, there's no replacement theology. When they're saying that, what they're saying is there's a dual covenant.
Yes.
That's not biblically coherent. That's not something historically Christians have believed. All are invited to be grafted in, as St. Paul states in Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. And later in Galatians, St. Paul calls the church the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16. So we understand that the church is Israel. That's really the only consistent way to understand the connection between the Old and New Testament. So to one other point about this, which is relevant, is modern day Jews reject Jesus, who is their Messiah. Therefore, they are the spirit of antichrist, as St. John says in his first epistle, chapter 2, verse 22. Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? He is antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. So just to unpack that a little bit, there's a difference between capital A final antichrist
Yes, right.
of the end of the world, and
Yes.
lowercase a acting in the spirit of antichrist. Anyone
Right.
who opposes Christ is antichrist, lowercase a. But there will be a final antichrist. That's a different thing. We're not saying all Jews are capital A antichrist. We're saying they're acting in the spirit of against Christ.
Yes, as are Muslims. That this is not, and I just want people to understand, like, we're not like, oh, I hate these people or I hate those people, or picking out groups and saying I hate diversity. All of these things that kind of get thrown at you at surface level, millimeter deep insults. That's not. We're explaining the theological differences of these religions. So just to cool any hurt feelings.
My approach here is not to browbeat or to say all Jews are in this evil cabal or whatever. This is more of like a systematic approach to what is Judaism theologically.
Yes, correct.
And why do we reject it as Orthodox Christians, and therefore what is true?
Yes.
Why is orthodoxy true? And so that's an important point, because I don't want other people to make it out to be like impossible for Jewish people to come to Orthodoxy or to come to the church.
We want, unlike Ben Shapiro, for us coming to his church, we want you to come to ours.
Right. Yeah. So just to summarize that last point, for simplification's sake, the church who was faithful to God is Israel. The Jews who reject him, who came as their Messiah, are not faithful to God because they reject their Messiah. Therefore, they are not Israel. They're not abiding by the conditions of faithfulness laid out in the Old Testament. God is faithful to those who are faithful to him. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what we're saying. Yes.
Where else? We got about 15 minutes. Where would you like to go with this? Because you're so good at this. I have some thoughts, but I don't want to get you out of here and you end up going, man, I wanted to say this one thing.
Okay. So there's a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament. I think most people are probably familiar with that a little bit. I mean, I can quote a few here. There's a lot of things that could. Let's talk about the fruit of Zionism being,
yes, please,
potentially
rotten.
Capital A Antichrist.
Yes, yeah.
And again, I don't have a ton to say on this because I know enough to be like, okay, no, that's how I operate in life generally. Is I know enough to have an intuition about things. I don't know a ton about a ton of things, but when I have things to say, I can write it down and put it out on a YouTube channel or whatever. So Jews are still looking for an earthly ruler. This will ultimately culminate in the role of the capital A final Antichrist. But it's not just the Jews that are looking for a future ruler. St. Paisios says, obviously, Zionists are preparing for an earthly king to be the Messiah. The Jehovah's Witnesses are also looking for an earthly king. Islam is seeking a future imam. Buddhism is awaiting the fifth Buddha. Hindus are anticipating their final avatar, Kalki, to usher in the next age. So really, no matter how you look at it, all of these major religions are aligning and preparing the way for the final reign of Antichrist. So it's something to be aware of when we're all heading toward this inflection point. To elaborate on St. Paisios' point, there's one other passage I'd like to quote from the Talmud in Eruvin 43b, which states, "It is only Elijah who will not arrive on Shabbat Eve, but the Messiah himself may arrive. For once the Messiah comes, all nations will be subservient to the Jewish people, and they will help him prepare whatever is needed for Shabbat." Rebuilding, that's the end of that quote. Rebuilding the third temple will be an indicator of the coming of the Antichrist. Zionists seek to do this at Temple Mount, which is where a Muslim mosque is currently standing. That is where the second temple used to be. The Antichrist will be a Jew, because the Jews will not accept any other Messiah. And also, there are a lot of Orthodox saints who say the same thing. So the West, more specifically, the United States, is kind of building the walls of Babylon as we speak by supporting Israel and its foreign policy. So the whole point of this, if you've got nothing else out of this, is not only is Judaism false, rabbinic Judaism, but Zionism, which is purported by a lot of rabbinic Jews, is a dangerous theology that will lead to the final reign of Antichrist. So it's not just this innocuous, I got this one theological thing wrong. It's like it leads to major geopolitical and global spiritual implications.
Yes, and the AIPAC lining the politicians' pockets, supporting any foreign policy mission that Israel wants, is part of this. Right. And that's why I'm doing this. I'm going to sprinkle these episodes throughout this year because it's massively important. And it's not us again going like, oh, these people are bad, I hate them, or you should hate them, or I'm anti. It's just explaining the correct theology, which is why I have guests on much smarter than myself, and the geopolitical implications of getting things wrong. It could be very bad. In fact, a lot of Zionists are pushing, it almost seems like they're pushing for the end of the world in some sense, which is frightening. Yeah.
Yeah. And also on that note, it's very easy to, if it comes to quote unquote conspiratorial topics, it can be very easy to say, oh, who's behind it? Like, is it these people? Is it that people? Like, who do we need to go, shoot up or whatever? Like, that's not, first of all, it doesn't really matter who's doing what. What matters is that it's being done.
Yes.
And if you're looking into these kinds of things, you need to look into it with the framework of what can I do to prepare myself and protect myself and my family about whatever may happen in the world. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter who's doing it. At the end of the day, they're operating in the spirit of Antichrist. They're working, their ultimate servant, their ultimate master, they're servants to the demons. They're being animated by these spiritual forces, whether they explicitly acknowledge that or not, doesn't really matter. It might be Jews over here, it might be WEF over there, it might be, different things pop up, but they're implicitly or explicitly, collaborating with demons. So I think it's a distraction to focus too much on who do we hate.
Yes. And because we're supposed to be praying for them as well, not hating.
Right.
And let me ask you this in closing. Do you not fear, I don't like that word. Do you predict a cracking down of orthodoxy coming in the near future? We know it's going to come at some point, but...
I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I don't know what to expect because I had expectations about how things were going to go towards the end of last year, and then I was wrong, and I was kind of surprised by that. I don't think it will be, if there's a crackdown on orthodoxy, I don't think it will be in the immediate future.
Okay.
I think if it happens, things could change very rapidly.
Sure.
But at least orthodoxy is persecuted globally, but at least here in America, we're generally fairly free to, go to church and that kind of thing.
Yes.
We're not having our churches shut down and that kind of thing.
Like the ones in Ukraine and Palestine, of course, and Syria. Right.
So I don't know. I don't really know what's going to happen. But there's a couple other things I wanted to mention before we wrap up, just so people,
please,
because I know people will go to extremes because I see it in my comments section. People will immediately be like, "Oh, you're right. and so is Hitler. Or they'll go, you're super wrong and you're completely misrepresenting Judaism, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like complete polar opposites. The thing is, Orthodoxy kind of occupies a weird space in between these extremes where
The royal
it does
path.
oppose Judaism, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Nazism is good. Just because Judaism is bad doesn't mean that
Right.
Nazism is good.
Yes.
You know, Nazism is predicated upon, and I know you're not falling into this, but I know that there are people who do fall into this because they comment on my videos. So the thing with Nazism specifically is it's still predicated on racial supremacy, which is the exact same mistake that Jews make when they think that they're better than the Gentile. And that is kind of the antithesis of what St. Paul is talking about.
Correct.
That in Christ there's no Jew or Gentile. So that's equally as antichrist to fall into that mistake.
Yes, thank you for that. Father Seraphim Rose writes and spoke on some of these. There's still spirits of revolution, or anti-Christian and whatnot. Anything else you want to get before we get out of here? I'm going to let you plug everything you'd like to, but before we get to that, anything else?
Yeah, I think just the main thing is, you don't need to necessarily know about the Talmud. You don't need to know about other Jewish texts like the Toledot Yeshu or the Jewish Encyclopedia or even the latest geopolitical developments to understand that Judaism is false. All you have to do is read the New Testament. Just read the Gospels, see how the Jews treat Jesus, see how Jesus responds to them. Read what some of the other apostles have to say on the issue. You know, it's not something I say gleefully. It's a tragedy that they reject their Messiah, and I pray that they will repent and come to Christ. But, we have to point this out for people. When I did my video, it was kind of twofold. It was A, to kind of refute Judaism and show that Orthodoxy is true, and B, to address the dispensationalist Zionist evangelical types that are getting wrapped up in this bad theology, which really has major eschatological implications.
Yes.
So it's a lot of issues, and I think also for those people, it's not just the scripture stuff. It's also, like, for them, I think it's two pillars. There's the pillar of the scripture, what they think that it says, which I addressed a little bit here.
Yeah.
And then there's also the pillar of their very strong eschatological views. And so if you really want to address that, I think you have to take out these two pillars.
Yes.
And also educate them on what Judaism actually is and what it actually teaches. Because there's a lot in the Talmud, not just the Talmud. I mean, the Toledot Yeshu. There's other sources that are very concerning and very blasphemous about the what Jews have to say about Christians and Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So it is an oxymoron to think that Judeo belongs next to Christian. That doesn't make sense.
Yes.
So all in all is just I hope people don't get the wrong idea from this. Just because we're criticizing Israel or Judaism doesn't mean that we hate Jews. It just means that their system of religion is false, and I hope that they come to Christ ultimately.
Yes. As are atheists and agnostics, who I have, I don't hate them either.
Right. Yeah.
That's that's such a sensitive topic for some reason when we're just explaining theological truths. But
I think people immediately go to one binary or the other.
Yes.
Just because.
Yeah. Well, the American culture loves, either A or B, and that there's nothing else, no other possible options out there.
Right.
The dialectic is a powerful thing, but I've often said orthodoxy smashes dialectic. So, so I hope that helps people. Bailey, plug your channel, anything you'd like, really.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier I run a channel called Unto Ages on YouTube. It's also on Rumble and streaming platforms as well. somebody told me my video was going to get taken down on YouTube, and they were surprised that it was still up. And so I need to make a Rumble account. And so it's still monetized. I haven't had any issues. I haven't had any strikes. So,
well, that's good.
I don't think I'll have any issues on YouTube because that's probably about as spicy as I intend to get.
Mm-hmm.
But if there were ever any issues, I'm on other platforms as well. So I mainly, I do a lot of pre-written, prepared apologetics kind of content, as well as some personal reflections on, kind of things that I see people falling into, whether they're Orthodox or not, issues in the culture that people are having. I plan to be doing some more interviews with people this year because I only know so many things. And when I run out of things to talk about, I need to have other people on to talk to them about those things. So that's probably what I'll be doing for a good chunk of this year.
Do you have a social media presence at all?
Not really. Okay. I try to be off social media.
You're a wise man. Very wise. All right. Bailey Mullins from the Unto Ages, I almost said of ages, from the Unto Ages YouTube channel. Thank you so much for being here on Counterflow.
Awesome. Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed that chat with Bailey Mullins from the Unto Ages YouTube channel. It's not a controversial topic, right? Nothing at all about that is controversial. I don't know why it is, to be quite honest with you, but it seems to be. And into another topic next week that I didn't think was particularly controversial until I took a trip to Mount Athos with our guest next week, Father Peter Heers, and we started discussing baptism versus chrismation. And as many of you know, they released a book on this, and we're going to discuss that. And he said, you should have seen the trouble just releasing this book on the topic got me into. And he said, all I did was reference church history, church writings, saints, church fathers. And boy, it got him into a lot of trouble. I don't get why. But next week, we are going to be talking about receiving the heterodox into the Orthodox Church, baptism, chrismation, all of these things. It's going to be a great episode. I mean, just the fact that it's Father Peter himself, I think, states that quite obviously. I look forward to it. Until then, you guys have a good one.
You get split in half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.